I'm your host, Riri. Welcome to Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose, where you'll find a community focused on resilience and perseverance, sharing untold stories of hope and rebuilding while dealing with major life interruption. This podcast is made by and for people in the process of reimagining their lives. We're here to raise the voices of those who often suffer in silence, living with chronic pain and/or disability. This space is for you. We encourage you to get involved. So stick around and let's jump right into the next episode. Welcome to episode 16, where we learn about our immune system and its role in chronic conditions. Today we're speaking with Dr. Kara Wada, Quadruple board-certified pediatric and adult allergy, immunology, and lifestyle medicine physician. Dr. Wada is able to connect with patients using her unique experience both as an autoimmune patient and physician. In our conversations, she speaks about the many hats that she wears and the challenges of acting like a medical detective, taking in tons of information from patients in addition to tests and other results, and trying to pinpoint what could be going on in their system. Many members of our reimagining community have been referred to autoimmune doctors when other specialists don't know how to help their patients. It's common for doctors to see one or more markers in blood work that will make them think the patient could have an autoimmune problem. Dr. Wada explains that chronic inflammation is our body's way of responding to something being wrong and is at the heart of most autoimmune conditions and why many patients get referred to her. However, as she explains, there's quite a bit of nuance involved with making a diagnosis and recommendations for treatment. So let's jump into our conversation. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, sort of a 1-minute overview? Do you yourself have any autoimmune or chronic conditions or disabilities?
Yeah, so about 2 years after I finished my training and was in my, first big girl job, I came back from maternity leave and went to see the dentist, and the hygienist said, "Hey, your mouth looks dry." And that ended up being this last puzzle piece that kind of really brought a constellation of symptoms I had dealt with for several years all into focus. And to make a long story short, I ended up being diagnosed with Sjogren's disease. And, as I have been living with that diagnosis now for coming up on 5 years, I've realized through many conversations of other folks with Sjogren's, other things that go along with it that I didn't necessarily realize I knew they were annoying and problematic, but I didn't necessarily label them as such, but deal with some dysautonomia or some issues with my automatic nervous system not working as it's supposed to. And then actually just recently was diagnosed with ADHD, which at 39 was a bit of a surprise. And so, yeah, this has been an interesting midlife journey.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And what about your professional background? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I am a practicing pediatric and adult allergy, immunology, and lifestyle medicine physician. I work at The Ohio State University. So I'm in academic practice. I'm in the clinic about 3 days a week. And then also do some other adventures outside of the office, which I think we'll probably talk about during our conversation. But I have a great opportunity where I am now to work with medical students, even undergrads sometimes that are interested in going into the health professions, all the way up through allergy immunology fellows. So they're board certified physicians, but they are spending that 2 extra years of training to really understand the nuances of the immune system and how it can misbehave. And so I really enjoy being able to interact and teach and impart, some of the wisdom I've gained not only through clinical practice over the last, 10 plus years, but also through those lived experiences as a chronic illness patient as well.
That's really fantastic. You kind of cover it all. I mean, it's like a full circle. That's great.
I'm trying to weave all the threads together. A nice tapestry yet or not, but we'll find out.
It's a work in progress like us all. So, given your background, and now it's clear why we are so happy to talk to you. I was hoping, you can help us sort of bust through some of the crazy things that people might think. So, when we talk about autoimmune conditions, what does that really mean? Is the body doing it something it shouldn't?
So, how I describe autoimmune, versus allergy, I go back to kind of this central concept of inflammation. Inflammation is our body's response, a very natural and needed response to infection and to injury. But we also can develop inappropriate or chronic inflammation, which I put in this category of insults with allergy and autoimmunity. But also, increasingly, we're recognizing that also has contributions from metabolic problems and microbiome issues too. So, autoimmunity is essentially our body's failure to recognize ourselves, our own tissues, our own proteins as safe. So, typically, the immune system should see all our bits and bobs and pieces and say, oh, yeah, you belong here. And at some point along the way, something has gone awry where it's now seeing that particular aspect of us as problematic or as it would act to protect us from a bacterial infection or viral infection, what have you. And so it's then having an inappropriate response to ourselves that then is inflicting damage upon ourselves.
That's a really great description. Thank you. So, is it a black and white thing, like either you have it or you don't, or is there nuance?
It is the most nuanced of things. So, when we think about how these conditions develop, when I first went through my medical school training, we were taught this idea of the hygiene hypothesis, this idea that the reason we're seeing so many people with allergies, so many people with autoimmune diseases, is because as a society, we're so much cleaner than we used to be. We have antibiotics, we have hand sanitizer, we vacuum. And that's part of it. But the reality is that we're seeing breakdowns in our barriers. So our skin, our airway, and our gut. And when these are all the places where our body interacts with the outside world, but they're also coded in a whole microbiome. So this whole other community of bacteria and archaea and viruses and fungi. And the types of and the numbers and the behavior of this whole ecosystem changes when those barriers are leaky. And we don't know if, the chicken or the egg, if which comes first, but those changes then result in our body seeing, our immune system seeing a whole lot more of the outside world than it, typically would. And that then leads to downstream effects of our immune system responding in ways that they're well intended, but they're not helpful. It can lead over time to development of, what meets diagnostic criteria for a condition. The reality is that we, though, have had these diagnostic criteria for particular conditions a long time before we knew any of this, underlying science. And so there is a lot of times what we call a prodrome, or this like period of time where patients may or may not feel or see symptoms. It seems like their body's not doing what it's typically supposed to be doing. So maybe they're having symptoms like IBS or, a lot of chronic sinus drainage or, other symptoms. And their labs are still normal or just a little bit off. And they don't necessarily click all of those boxes that meet a diagnostic criteria. And so that, that's where some of this nuance comes into play. And I think gets lost in the discussion because if we think, for instance, about how we typically diagnose thyroid issues like Hashimoto's, for instance, often that diagnosis is made when the thyroid gland has significant damage done, so much significant damage that you need hormone to replace what's no longer being made by the body. So you kind of have to reach a tipping point in certain conditions before. Yeah, there is nuance in how we think of and how we diagnose autoimmune conditions. So oftentimes symptoms and signs, so what we see on physical exam and labs, all have to hit certain check boxes in order to meet what we call diagnostic criteria. And diagnostic criteria is really helpful for us to study how certain treatments work, how to know how certain conditions and diseases tend to what happens over time with these patients, but they also sometimes, I think, are a source of frustration on the patient side because you very well may be on your way to a particular diagnosis over a period of time. And we call that period of time from that happens before someone hits diagnostic criteria as a prodromal period. So this time where you may not feel 100%, or frankly, you may feel pretty crappy because you have ongoing, oftentimes systemic or chronic inflammation, but there hasn't been enough to kind of tip you over the edge into hitting all of those check boxes. And so I think that's where there's a lot of nuance in the discussion, but also I think a lot of hope in potential to reverse course as best as we may be able to, either through lifestyle or, my hope is to see some more medical research kind of looking at ways to do this as well.
That's a really great point. And I didn't think of it from that perspective that, that could be a positive thing that could potentially be maybe not reversed completely, but made better.
Yeah, or slow down that train.
Yeah. Well, and we'll take anything we can get.
Right. Right.
So so clearly your work goes beyond just diagnosis. It sounds like you kind of work like a detective.
Yeah, absolutely. I use that analogy all the time in clinic. I tell patients I'm going to put my Sherlock Holmes detective hat on, and I want to hear about your lived experience, and then let's try to take what you are experiencing in your life, combine that with what I know about the body and the immune system, and let's try to make heads or tails out of what that might be. What are all those possibilities? How, what are your goals and what are my goals? And then how can we work together as a team towards them?
Yeah, that's a really great approach. I'm thinking especially of, in our audience and myself, people have conditions or disabilities which I assume makes them sort of more vulnerable to more difficulties in terms of medical issues and stuff going on. So I guess I'm thinking as a detective, like, what's the most difficult part of your job or what helps you be more successful?
Honestly, I think sometimes time constraints. I think, the other thing that really is challenging is I have to build trust with my patients. Many of them have really seen how the sausage is made within the medical system, and rightfully so, aren't just willing to be, like, oh gosh, I'm going to put my trust and vulnerability in you because they've been burned. And so, I think that takes time to break down kind of those walls to build trust and to then think through and what might be going on and to be patient with that. I think that's something I struggle with is I want to be able to help people feel better as quickly as possible, but the reality is that oftentimes, like with many things in life, it's a bit of a slow burn.
Yeah, so true. Is there anything that patients from their side can do to sort of help the process?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I've been really trying to talk and write and make tools available is to make the most of that time you have with your healthcare team. And we can do that by, one, I can share with people, okay, here's how I think. Here's how doctors are trained to think. If you are able to spend even, 15 minutes before that visit to kind of like prepare, like you're going into a meeting or an appointment as an active participant and thinking about what it is that you need to communicate, what your goals are for that visit, and kind of having a bit of a game plan can be really helpful in order to make the most of a visit. Like I have the luxury of having 30 and 60-minute visits, which is kind of unheard
Mm,
of. Most often you're going to, most docs are kind of in a practice situation where it's being kind of dictated that they have maybe 20 minutes, maybe 40 minutes if they're lucky with a new patient, 30, 40 minutes with a new patient. And you can ask, when you schedule an appointment, you can ask, how long are the doc's appointments scheduled for? And that might kind of give you an idea of the scope of what you might be able to cover too.
yeah. Well, I guess we need to do our homework and get ready, just like for so many things.
I know.
That's great. It's a good point. No,
It's
it's
like
helpful to know.
it's kind of the reality is that at least in the US, and I can't speak for any other systems, the healthcare system is essentially a dumpster fire in many ways, especially for those of us with chronic invisible conditions. And the reality is, I don't foresee the system changing as a whole too rapidly. Like, I think I'm seeing some like positive things happening. And yet, we also, and I'm saying we from the patient side of things, have to do what we can to function within that broken system to the best of our ability. And I will say, with my physician hat on, we're also trying to do our best to function within the system too.
For sure. So, thinking about people who have autoimmune issues and maybe disabilities, are there frequent comorbidities and sort of what does that mean or look like?
Yeah, I mean, not uncommon to see issues with chronic pain. Oftentimes, these are all broad brushstrokes. We all, have our own illness stories, but there is a pretty strong association with, in particular, trauma in childhood that is associated with development of chronic inflammatory conditions, autoimmune disease in particular, and disorders that relate to chronic pain. So, what will happen often in folks who have experienced a significant amount of trauma? So, the scoring for this is called the ACE score, the Adverse Childhood Event Score. For those who might be familiar, that has a tendency to up or, kind of turn up the dial in our brain, in those survival kind of pain centers, our limbic center of our brain, so that our set point is a little bit different than those who aren't. Our stress responses are always kind of thought to be kind of on board. So, kind of always in that chronic kind of state of fight or flight. And so, then that also can increase our risk of heart disease, diabetes, weight issues, metabolism issues. So, that you do see a fair bit of overlap. And then, certainly, mood disorders as well. And so, not everyone has all of these, but it's kind of those overlapping circles in a Venn diagram, that you'll see that many of us have more than one thing kind of going on.
Mhm. Okay. So, I'm thinking of you as you're having your physician hat on. So, how do you recommend people handle going back to the doctor that referred them to you as the autoimmune specialist when you don't think that they have an autoimmune condition?
I will say more often than not, there likely is some element of chronic inflammation driving, vast majority of symptoms that we all experience. So we've kind of realized that most of the diseases that we experience in our modern life, aside from like a simple cold or a broken bone, those sorts of things are driven in large part by chronic inflammation. So I think usually I have kind of something to say or suggest kind of on that. But, I think coming back, if it is that, yeah, this doesn't seem to be an autoimmune flavor, I think it's helpful to let the primary care doc know and also say, hey, if this is not it, what could we be missing? And thoughts on what we might do about whatever symptoms or what have you might be most bothersome, most distressing, or in the meantime too.
Do you ever speak to either primary care or referring physicians to sort of brainstorm that way, or is there sort of not time for that? Doesn't happen?
Sometimes I think it depends on the circumstance. I will say it is generally easier to do that, like within the greater kind of system I work within, because we can do that in the form of almost like a old school AOL instant messenger, like where you get your little like text chat going and you add the people in the group. I have that going for a few patients that I co-manage with my brilliant rheumatology colleague that we're both trying to figure out for these particular individuals what's dysregulating their immune system. How is it, how can we kind of reverse that? And so that is, certainly when you're in practice, you get to know certain colleagues. And so my former OB messaged me yesterday. She has a patient that she needs some help with. And so often we'll be, kind of texting, hey, can you hop on the phone, to talk about this patient? So I think it is helpful sometimes as you build those relationships, but it's not always as easy as we'd like to communicate with one another.
So I'm also thinking about you as your professional hat on. So, what have you learned in all of your experience about working with people with chronic pain and disability over the years? I know you mentioned some about, being linked to inflammation, but I'm wondering if there are sort of, I don't know, lessons learned
Yeah,
kind of, or
absolutely.
yeah.
I'm in the process, and I haven't talked about this much publicly yet, but I'm in the process of writing a collaborative book with other physicians that are also autoimmune patients. Like, what are the lessons we didn't learn in medical school that I'm excited about? But, I think one of the big lessons I've learned is that mindset is incredibly important. That's been critical in my own journey as a patient and also my journey as a physician too. I think, around the time I was diagnosed, I was incredibly burnt out. Like I was so exhausted and, every little keystroke and click box and everything just felt like it was like, death by a million paper cuts. And so, learning how to better set boundaries, have conversations with folks to recognize that self-care is the least selfish thing we can do. Realizing that the way I think about things or knowing that my brain is going to offer me thoughts about a situation. It's going to tell me stories about what I'm seeing and hearing based on what I've lived, what I've, experienced through my life. But it's just that it's a story. And if we can put a little space sometimes between that story and like the cold hard facts, I think that can be really helpful of like, like maybe my husband wasn't being a jerk, right? Like he was trying to be helpful. So I think, there's all these little pearls that I think have come up along the way. I think the big thing though is understanding that I think going back to the self-care isn't selfish, that spending some of my precious spoons on taking care of myself, especially those ones that I know recharge those and like help me add spoons, it's critically important. And if I don't do that, then I'm not showing up as I want to, or I'm able to, as a parent, as a partner, as a physician. And yeah, it may mean that my kids are with the babysitter an extra 30 minutes, but that 30 minutes that I spend on getting some movement in, or 5 minutes journaling, or what have you, is what's needed, right?
That's so wise. I kind of want to have that written on every room in my home.
For a long while, I had it as the backdrop on my phone, like
Oh,
wallpaper. I guess that's what it's called.
that's very smart.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very wise. So I guess I have another question from your professional experience. So, how long do you think, obviously, it varies by person, by condition, all of these things, but how long would you estimate it could take someone to start feeling or seeing real progress from making lifestyle changes or medical changes? Let's say they do have an autoimmune condition that's just diagnosed. Sort of how long does that take to sort of start seeing difference?
Pretty quickly. I mean, I would say in the series of days to weeks, especially if you're hitting those high yield areas, right? The tried and true things that, over time, I think you learn the nuance. Like for me, I've realized that sleep is non-negotiable. Like that is a big part of my pie of, like, if you're thinking about, life as a pie, and or your self-care is a pie, like how much certain things influence. Over and above that influences things more than food for me, probably more than movement. And it's probably up there with my stress management kind of piece of things, because I do tend to be someone who is wired, I think, a little more empathic, and kind of have that more fight or flight set point set a little higher, that I'm actively working on every day. But yeah, so if you're having difficulty with getting good restful sleep, certainly try the things, keeping your room cool, making sure it's dark, having a routine or a ritual that helps you get ready for bed, making sure you're not having caffeine after lunch, those more of those sleep hygiene things. But we know sleep hygiene only goes so far. And so if you are still struggling with sleep, that is the time to maybe connect with a sleep medicine specialist, because that is critical. Similar, if you're thinking about, okay, no, I'd rather focus on nutrition. We know that we see changes in the microbiome within 24 to 30 hours of changes in the input. And so there can be rapid shifts over time. I generally advocate for coming from a space of, what can I add that's going to be beneficial versus what can I eliminate? Though I will say that there are a fair number of people that will notice, especially if they minimize their refined carbohydrates, kind of the white sugar, white flour, that can be really helpful. It's a big part of our modern diet that really is quite new as we think about the history of human beings, and does have some implications for our gut health. Doesn't mean you're totally cutting out all carbs. It's just trying to get rid of some of that extra refined stuff. And then thinking about, like, okay, what can I add? Like, can I add more color? Can I add more flavors with anti-inflammatory spices and herbs? And what about some healthy fats, or, and some lean protein, and maybe experimenting with some plant-based protein, and seeing if you like it, can be helpful. I will say, don't jump totally into the deep end and make yourself a big bowl of Brussels sprouts and cauliflower rice and tofu, and if you're not used to eating those sorts of things, because that could just end up with lots of tummy distress. So I'm a big fan of starting slow and letting things grow over time. And then, I think stress is another big thing. And for me, movement is a way that I'm able to manage stress. So I kind of get a little double whammy of getting some stress relief by doing movement that is fun and not punishing. I think for a long time, I thought of exercise had to be no pain, no gain. And certainly there is an element of like a little discomfort, right? As you're growing and I'm working on goals, but I know I totally overdid it if I'm still hurting a day or two, 2 days after a workout, or I'm not able to like walk normally or to my normal. And then I got to scale back a little bit. And that was not helpful.
Yeah, those are great
Yeah.
suggestions. Thank you. That's really helpful and wise. Take things slowly, little bits at a time. Don't do drastic things. Yeah.
Yeah, our body tends to like that better, and our brain does too. I think two books that I've read that I can't recommend enough, Atomic Habits and Tiny Habits. Both, pick one. You probably don't, you could read both if you are, want to nerd out like me. But they both talk about behavior change science and how our brains best incorporate new things into our lives. And so if you want to make something pleasant, you want to make it feel good, taste good, you want to make it attractive, you want to make it look good and easily available, that's ways that you can start incorporating something new and also tying it to a behavior that you already do. So if you already know every morning I am so good about taking my meds, I put mine right by the coffee maker because I knew I was already making coffee, or my husband was, I was going to get a cup of coffee. And so my meds are right there. So I tied that to that. But now my meds are such a part of my routine that I tie new behavior to like, okay, what could I do right after I take my meds? And start with a really mini behavior. So 30 to 60-second version of whatever it is you have in mind as your big picture. Like miniaturize it, at least at first, and then do it. So if you want to go for a walk, just put on your shoes. And then you're going to celebrate that mini behavior in a genuine way that you would typically celebrate. So for me, I put my hands up in the air and I like do, like at the end of a Breakfast Club where they're like, yeah, that feels good to me. That gets like my happy hormone or happy neurochemicals going. And keeping up with that helps then you build upon that. So if you put your shoes on, you're probably going to go out and maybe walk half a block or do, you might, but celebrate just putting the shoes on in itself. And then that will grow over time.
Yeah, that's really great. And I love the image. I can totally picture that. Awesome. So I think I know the answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Are you in favor of incorporating Eastern and Western medicine at the same time?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I think there is a lot of wisdom to be gained from, Ayurveda, from traditional Chinese medicine, and similar, philosophies. I think it is important though to be open and honest with your, medical team so they know, because there sometimes can be interactions, with particular, especially supplements or herbals. So it's, really important to make sure that everyone's kind of, knows what's going on. And then I think helpful to, assess, like, do you think that the juice is worth the squeeze? And whatever you're using as a modality, do you feel like you are getting benefit from it? And just kind of having, this ongoing assessment, especially in those areas that may have less body of more Western randomized controlled trial type stuff. I find great benefit personally in Reiki. I know it helps set like lower kind of my stress levels. I am able to get into kind of this meditative state without falling asleep, which has been really restorative. And, there's some smaller studies that, it's helpful, but it's not the most robust. There's pretty good, but
Each person has to take it in their own
yeah,
way.
we're each an N of one. We use N as like the number in a study, but we're our own study.
It's true. I mean, everybody is. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, in another conversation we had, we were talking about our medical system and how frustrating it is from all sides, from the patient side, from the physician side, from all around. And we talked about transparency in the medical system, and you mentioned a couple things that I at least wasn't aware of. Can you share with our audience, like, how can potential patients learn if their doctors are being paid to prescribe a certain type of medicine or something like that?
Yeah. So, well, one of the things that I laugh about is that often patients will, or not patients, people on the internet will comment, like if I mention being conscientious and thoughtful about using supplements, they'll say, "Oh, you're just being paid by big pharma." And I'm like, I kind of laugh. You can look up if someone has received funding from, there's actually legislation in place. And so there is a website you can go on to through Medicare and CMS, and you can look up to see, how much or any monies that a particular physician has received. I also, as being a state employee, have to fill out a form every year that documents my financial ties to different companies. So I have to report that I have my Crunchy Allergist LLC and had a recent contract with another company to help with some educational efforts. So I think that's another, way, if it is a public institution, on the doctor's profile, it should be listed there. Things that aren't mandated are those affiliations with different supplement companies or, non-standardized testing modalities that often will have some sort of kickback. So for instance, and I would advocate for there being more transparency all over the place. I recently started a profile on FullScript. FullScript is a company that helps doctors and other healthcare professionals write recommendations for supplements for their patients. And on there is like a profit sharing functionality. And so on there, you can kind of select, okay, I want my patient to get this much discount, and then I would get this much profit. And so I have always been pretty hesitant about those sorts of things. But I think, I've also feel like if I feel like disclosure and a little sunshine is also the best disinfectant. And so, as I have not set that up officially through my practice quite yet, but that will be part of the discussion if I say, "Hey, here's a place where you can order these. You also can go to Amazon wherever and order them too. It's fine. If you order them through here, here's what you get as a benefit, but here's also what I'm getting in return." For me, that's how I feel most in alignment with my values. But that's not, there's no law dictating that anyone has to disclose that either.
Right. That's really, I appreciate your sharing that, because I think a lot of people don't know that. And I think it is helpful, especially when you're maybe going to a doctor for the first time or trying to pick one. I think that's just something helpful to know. If people want to look into it, they can.
Yeah, I think just helpful as you're thinking about, like, in particular with supplements that may not have a ton of data behind them. If you're, someplace and like, oh, yeah, now on your way out, you can pick these all up. I think just asking, like, hey, how much are you getting from, like, or like, I don't know. I just like, I'd
Yeah.
always, it's kind of like, okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's totally.
And I don't think there's money in itself is not good nor bad. And it takes money to keep the lights on in an office and pay the staff. And for me, for my business stuff, it takes money to run. And I'm sure, to have a podcast, to have this program that we're recording the podcast through. Like, but like I said, I think sunshine's the best disinfectant. So the more we can have these conversations about it, I think it helps air out the dirty laundry.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you and have you share about your maybe third hat or whatever number hat. What how you're starting to work with patients or clients as a coach, and what is that? What do you hope to bring to it, and what's your role?
I think one of the big things I hear time and time again and experienced myself is this loss of confidence in our abilities, especially with brain fog and like pain. And we get into this, don't want to move or do much activity and don't feel comfortable in our bodies with these chronic inflammatory conditions. And so, I really center around and through my podcast and through my coaching and course material is becoming immune confident. So building resiliency through our mindset, through our habits, both in how we mentally approach living with a chronic inflammatory condition, but also quite literally, how can we turn the dial down on inflammation using, aspects to our daily routines to help us rather than harm us. And doing that through the lens of a busy doctor mom, 3 young kids. I'm from the Midwest. I love a good deal. Like doing stuff with an element of a little bit more practicality and sustainability, because the reality is that it's showing up for ourselves day in and day out in a meaningful and mindful way that is what helps us build that confidence over time. It's also what helps us, from a health standpoint too, when we're able to eat more nutritiously, move more, sleep better, deal with the stressors that life throws us, whether it's, sewage backing up in your basement or a flare, right? We had that happen not that long ago. All those tools that, one, I found really helpful, but two, have science support behind them too. And so, yeah, I have talk about that, all that on the Becoming Immune Confident podcast, but then also through 12-week course and work through that in group and one-on-one coaching too.
Wow, that sounds great. So if people want to find out more about that, how can they do
Yeah,
that?
the hub of everything is at Dr. Kara, Kara, Wada, WADA.com. I have a little tab that says work with me or something to that effect. And that kind of
Okay.
lists all of those things there. There's also a little separate link to the podcast. And if you prefer watching, it's on YouTube. If you prefer listening, it's on all the channels. And then we
Yeah.
also work to take those transcripts and turn them into blogs for people who really prefer reading instead, because I know all of us tend to learn in different ways. And so
Right.
try to make all those different modalities available.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
And do people need to be like in your regional area, or is this
No, I mean for the course and coaching, I do that kind of nationally, internationally. I've had a couple of
okay?
clients from Canada. And then it's more kind of just making sure our time zones align as best we can. For medical care, I see patients in Columbus, Ohio. And so there is a link there to link to my office site too. And if folks are within Ohio, there is the possibility of telehealth as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now we've come to our rapid fire 5 for 5 questions. Please answer honestly and quickly, whatever comes to mind. So the first one is, what's your favorite sound?
I love the sound of like a summer evening. Like some of the little
Mm,
crickets and like the breeze and yeah, maybe a little campfire crackling. Yeah. Mhm.
okay, I can picture it. What's your favorite word?
Ooh. This year it's been no. And it's been because I'm actively trying to say no to anything that is not a hell yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's healthy. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, it's kind of funny that that has to be a change,
Yeah.
but Yeah. Okay. Favorite guilty pleasure?
An ice cream sundae.
Mm. What's something you've learned that you wish other people would understand?
Self-care is not selfish.
Yeah. And the last one, what advice would you give to an 18-year-old version of you?
Ooh. Stop giving a hoot about what other people think about you because they really are worried about themselves. Like their opinions don't matter. Let it go.
That's fabulous.
Pre-Elsa back
Okay.
then, but let it go.
Yeah. All right. So those are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you wanted to say or add?
Just thank you so much for the opportunity for this conversation and platform you have created. I think more dialogue and more discussion is so critically needed. There's such a breakdown between, I think the chronic illness community and physicians in particular for so many reasons, but I really would like to see a slow rebuilding of trust between the two because I think it will be healing for all.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I totally agree. And this has been a great way to hopefully help some people learn more about your specialty and a little bit from the doctor's perspective. So really thank you very much. This episode highlighted the importance of patients and physicians working in partnership to try to solve complex conditions. One of the most difficult parts of living with a chronic illness or disability is trying to get an accurate diagnosis. Many people never get a clear diagnosis because though we have very advanced medical tests and trainings, there's still many things that doctors don't know. Finding a diagnosis often feels like validation for patients who have been dealing with symptoms that have been a mystery for quite some time. For the physician, a diagnosis often means being able to help their patient reduce their symptoms or better manage their condition. Coming up with a diagnosis is no small task. Dr. Wada speaks about the importance of building rapport with her patients, especially chronic illness patients, who have often been burned before and are therefore less trusting of the medical system. There's also nuance when we're talking about autoimmune conditions. Patients might be in a prodromal period when patients may not be aware of some of their symptoms, or they're just more mild before escalating to a higher level. Dr. Wada also spoke about the medical system from a physician's and patient's perspective. For patients with chronic illness or disability, the medical system, she says, is like a dumpster fire and is not likely to change anytime soon. The only thing we as patients can do is approach our doctor visits like a meeting that we need to prepare for. She recommends reviewing all of the new information you're bringing, writing down your questions in advance, and making the most out of the limited time you have with your physician. Physicians also struggle with the system, which typically prevents them from being able to spend an extended amount of time with their patients. In this kind of detective work, details are important, so make sure you have a list of all your symptoms. Dr. Wada also talks about the importance of mindset for the patient and the physician. When she was diagnosed herself with an autoimmune condition, she was so overwhelmed that things became too much. She spoke about the importance of learning how to better set boundaries and have upfront conversations with colleagues and loved ones about her needs and recognizing and prioritizing self-care, which she notes is the least selfish thing we can do. It's also important to remember that your brain is going to tell you stories. That's what it does. But those stories may not be accurate. Reminding and training yourself to revisit the story and question if it fits within the reality you see is critical. Understand that spending some precious spoons, especially those that will help recharge your batteries, are critically important. No matter what changes you make to diet, lifestyle, or other areas, Dr. Wada's philosophy is always to go slow and change things in moderation. Dr. Wada is the host of the Becoming Immune Confident podcast, where she interviews guests and shares many recommendations for handling tons of different aspects of life, from managing behavior change to the power of a mind-body medicine, and many more. We'll share a link to her podcast in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Life from Pain to Purpose. We're always interested to hear your feedback and questions. So leave a review and drop us a note at reimagininglifepodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook or Instagram. We hope you'll tune in for the next episode.